I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out from your busy schedule to come to us here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'd like to begin with a very basic question. Many things have changed within this country in the past few years. Since you have been at the forefront of things, I must say, in spite of many difficulties that many other people have had in the past 10 years, you have been one of the more consistent people. And I'm not saying that just because you're here. It happens to be a fact. And I'd like to ask you a very basic question. How do you perceive this country now? How do you perceive, or do you perceive it any differently than you did, say, 10 or 12 or 15 years ago?
Well, things have changed, of course. Time never stands still. I think that contrary to many of the assertions that we see in established press in this country, the potential for a tremendous people's movement is greater now than ever before. And of course there's a tendency now to look back on the late 60s as the years of mass rebellion in this country which have gone by. What we're witnessing today is a tremendous crisis of monopoly capitalism that is touching working people in this country in a way that they have not felt an economic crisis since perhaps the 30s. It's especially hurting black people, Puerto Ricans, other people of color. And I think that the possibility exists at this moment for organizing the kind of people's movement that can bring about some fundamental changes. That's why I'm running as the vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party, along with Gus Hall, who is our presidential candidate.
You sort of got ahead of a question I wanted to ask you. Why run? Especially as I asked Gus when he was here the last time, you know that you can't win in the sense that you can't become the next vice president of this country. Why do you continue to pursue that course?
Well, I imagine that when you interviewed Gus, he probably pointed out, as I'm about to do now, that we are very serious in our candidacy. Most people, I think, most black people, and certainly many working people recognize that whoever is elected in November, they're going to lose. They're going to be the losers, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or even a John Anderson. Working people in this country will be in very bad shape, so that it becomes extremely important for the abandoned majority to have a voice during this electoral period. It becomes important not to allow whoever is elected to be able to say that black people don't care. They didn't come to the polls to vote. That could be used as a mandate to further intensify racism. So we're running in order to give the people of this country, people of color, oppressed people, workers, a voice during this electoral period, in order to be able to influence the outcome of the elections, in order to be able to influence what happens afterwards. And then we have a long-range perspective. We feel, as I think many, many people, communist and non-communist alike, feel that we need a new party. We need a party that will not take its leadership from the circles of monopoly capitalism in this country. So this campaign is also a stepping stone in the direction of creating a coalition, an anti-monopoly coalition, that will be able to establish a political party that sometime in the near future will be victorious at the polls.
In your opening statements, you mentioned the severe crisis under which we all are existing right now. Many of the manifestations, of course, in the area of unemployment, literally hunger on the part of many people, the energy problems, housing problems, and so on. Some people might argue that your position, your short-term goal, if you will, does not manifest any intrinsic value to them. In other words, it does not address itself to these basic questions that affect them immediately. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean, because our campaign is based on dealing with the immediate needs of people, but with a long-range perspective of understanding that some real fundamental changes have to take place in this country. We need to smash the ability of the monopolies to control the lives of people in this country. We're calling, for example, for the 6-hour workday. That is one of the concrete ways in which the creation of millions of jobs can take place. We're calling for the slashing of the military budget by $100 billion, $50 billion of which should be used to rebuild the city. We're talking about the need to fight for the illegalization of racism in order to prevent the further rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party, and other similar organizations. The question of peace is an immediate problem. We're calling for the signing of the ratification of SALT II and the continuation of the process of nuclear disarmament. Because if we cannot prevent the outbreak of a nuclear war in the world, then we won't be able to count on having any future at all, much less a future that is based on the needs of people in this country. We're calling for the immediate shutdown of all of the nuclear energy plants, given the experience of 3 Mile Island and other such plants around the country. So we're speaking to. I mean, the point is that it becomes necessary to talk to people about why it is that the problems can't be solved. Why is the Republican Party and both the Democratic Party failing to deal with the job situation? Because their programs are based on maximizing the profits of the corporations. Our theme is people before profits, right now and far into the future.
There are other parties which espouse a similar view on the left and which are in fact contesting the elections. I can name a few, but I think you're familiar with them already. Looking at the situation in Europe and other advanced capitalist countries, we find that many broad coalitions, left-leaning and left coalitions, have been forged in order that they might better address themselves to the kind of issues that you're talking about. The best example perhaps is France, even though it didn't work out in the last election. Do you see that sort of strategy being adopted by your party in this country? Perhaps not this time out, but next time around.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, we make it very clear that as we campaign, we are not campaigning against other progressive parties. We're campaigning against the monopolies. And we're expressly calling for the creation of an anti-monopoly coalition, which can establish a party. We feel that it's extremely important in this anti-monopoly coalition that labor be at the very core. It must be deeply rooted in the working class. And during this election, we are encouraging the developments of moving in the direction of independent politics outside the two-party system. As a matter of fact, in California, we participated in the Peace and Freedom Party primary precisely in order to begin to consolidate that kind of unity.
I wonder if we might turn to one or two foreign policy questions. It seems to me, as somebody said a long time ago, that patriotism is a final refuge of scoundrels and other such characters. We find that most, if not all, of the so-called major candidates are, in fact, attempting to drape themselves in the national flag and call the people to arms against some enemy out there. I'd like us to focus on one particular region of the world, namely the Middle Eastern region. The last time your presidential candidate was here, we really didn't get enough time to go into that. I wonder if you might talk about the party's perception of that and the implications of the the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for the entire region. How would you address the issue of resolving the question of Palestine?
Okay, well, to preface my remarks, and then I should say that the Communist Party is, as a party reflecting the working class in this country, has an international perspective. We see ourselves as a part of an international working class movement with responsibilities to develop international solidarity in defense of our sisters and brothers in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East. That is one of the basic principles of our party. And of course, we are very staunch defenders of the rights of the Palestinian people to national sovereignty. We point out that, however, that contrary to what the media, the established media, have said in this country, it's not a question of a Arab-Jewish conflict at all. It's a question of the struggle against Zionism. And the Zionist government in Israel does not reflect the needs and the interest of the majority of the people of Israel. There are Jews in Israel who are victims of racism and discrimination. And with our ties to the Israeli Communist Party, we are able to see the possibility of developing a multiracial challenge to Zionism. But to answer your question, we do very vigorously defend the rights of the Palestinian people.
I pose the question because it is a central question to electoral politics in this country. I think we could be honest about that. It is central not only from an internal, looking at it internally vis-a-vis the United States, but looking at it internally vis-a-vis the region. The so-called Arab bloc certainly has a stake in the resolution of the conflict, and certainly the Israeli government and its allies in the West, both the United States and Western Europe, has, if you will, a stake in it. Recently, we have witnessed a sort of fragmentation among the Western bloc on the Palestinian question. And I was merely trying to elicit how you see things going. How, where do you see things going from this point on, and where would your party urge? In which direction would you urge negotiators to go on the Palestinian question?
Well, I think that our job really is the creation of a movement of solidarity. We respect the position of the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people recognized at the United Nations. And we feel that it's extremely important to develop the kind of solidarity movement in this country that will facilitate the resolution of the conflict in the Middle East. Now, I pointed out before that it becomes important to have a clear ideological vision of that, because it's being used in order to divide people in this country. We saw what happened with the situation of Andy Young in the United Nations, where they attempted to create the impression that there was this rift between black people and Jews as a result of the position that Andrew Young assumed. I think that we were very much aware of the significance of the response to the situation of Andrew Young, where black people in this country were in their vast majority in favor of solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think that is something that has to be understood very clearly. The political consciousness of the black community has matured to an extremely high level.
Today marks the opening of the Olympics, and in a not too far away region of the Middle East, or the Central Asia, there's of course Afghanistan. which has been used, the act taken by the Soviet Union to aid the Afghan people, has been used as a basis for the U.S. boycotting the Olympics. Do you think that's the real reason?
Well, no. Because, well, first of all, the CIA was organizing the counter-revolution in Afghanistan before the Soviet Union went in. The Soviet Union came in to assist the revolution in Afghanistan because it was being threatened by forces that were being assisted and organized in some instances directly by the CIA in the very same way, as I pointed out in my speech last night, that the CIA participated in organizing the counter-revolution in Chile in order to destroy the Unidad Popular government. And now we discover that the Carter administration, whose foreign policy is being shaped by Mr. Brzezinski, who of course represents the most reactionary hawks of the ruling class, they're moving in a very dangerous direction. They're moving consciously in the direction of war. The situation in Afghanistan has been used in order to further elevate the war hysteria in this country. And I think that the response of many of the athletes to Carter's plans to boycott the Olympics was quite conscious. And I think that we should continue to support those who attempted to go into court to prevent him from banning U.S. athletes from participating in the Olympics. But if we look at what's happening in the Soviet Union with the Olympics, we see in a very concrete way, the waning influence of U.S. imperialism. The Olympics will continue. And there scores of countries are being represented. And there are even U.S. athletes at the Olympics, despite the position taken by Carter.
Complementing the overall strategy of Mr. Brzezinski and Carter is a campaign of human rights, a so-called human rights campaign. We could argue about whether or not there have been human rights violations in some countries, and of course we'd have to establish criteria to determine what do we mean by human rights. Are we talking about the rights of individuals or societies and whatnot? But generally speaking, how do you read that? I know there's the obvious thing, one could say, well, it's a ruse for in order to cover, capitalist objectives and whatnot. But is it on the wane? Are they shifting away from that and to a more bellicose kind of posture, ignoring even the hypocritical campaign which has been carried out?
Well, it was, of course, the human rights, so-called human rights policy has been a part of a larger anti-communist strategy. What has happened over the last years is that it's become clear to a lot of people on various levels that something is wrong with the system. And we have in existence in the world socialist societies where unemployment has continued to rise. In this country, there are socialist countries that have continued to have a labor shortage simply because of the fact that they are constructing societies based on the needs of people. You tell students, for example, who cannot now go to college because of the rise in tuition, because of the lack of financial aid, that in Cuba or the Soviet Union, not only is education free, but students are paid to go to school. You talk about the lack of medical care in this country and point to socialist countries where all medical care is free. the high rents in this country. Socialist countries, the rents are around 5% of one's income. And I think that the strategists for the ruling class in this country have understood very well that if something cannot be done to discredit socialism, that the movement toward the creation of a socialist society in this country would grow stronger. Thus the emergence of the so-called human rights campaign, in which Carter essentially said, well, they may not have unemployment, they may have enough to eat, they may have a good medical system, but they have no human rights. And of course, that is absolutely ridiculous. That notion of the people of the socialist country not having the kinds of human rights he pointed out, but it's actually quite simplistic, and I think that oftentimes the so-called leaders of this country underestimate the intelligence of the masses of people who could not be deceived by this fake human rights campaign, because people have realized that in terms of the kind of human rights that Carter was allegedly talking about, the worst violations are in places like South Africa, in Chile, in pre-revolutionary Iran, and in this country where there are more political prisoners in the prisons than there were during the late 60s.
And speaking of political prisoners, we are talking with Angela Davis, who was herself a political prisoner, and perhaps still is if you look at the broader definition of the term. And this is WBAI in New York City. We will be hoping to receive your phone calls in a few minutes, and I hope Angela is willing to accept those. Are you?
Certainly.
Oh, very good. I'd like to ask you a couple more questions before we do, though.
Sure.
Looking south of where we are now at an area such as Liberty City, which is ironic, in Miami, and looking at another part of Miami where we recently saw the bacchanal of so-called Cuban refugees coming to this country. First, I'd like you to look at the Liberty City question. Do you see this as a signal of things to come in this country?
I think that it is a danger signal. It ought to act as a signal to those of us who are involved in organizing progressive movements that we had better hurry up and get on our jobs, because the frustrations continue to accumulate. The problems that Black people, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, other people from oppressed communities, and white working people are confronting today are becoming more and more and more intense. And they reach the boiling point and cannot but explode. That energy has to be harnessed and focused into movements demanding jobs, movements demanding an end to police crimes, movements demanding an end to the draft registration, because we do not want to see the creation of a draft in this country. We know that wherever there has been a draft, there's always been a war. So I think that what happened in Miami, the rebellion, is a confirmation of what many of us have recognized for some time, namely that the economic situation of people of color and of working people in general in this country has been consistently deteriorating. And we must create the kind of movement that will allow us to move forward. It frightens me. It frightens me because having gone through the experience of the rebellions during the late 60s, I realize that the police departments across the country are far more capable today of smashing these spontaneous outbreaks. They have paramilitary squads in virtually every police department. They have weaponry that was used and proved in Vietnam. And I think that there may be massacres. And we cannot let that happen. We need to be out in the streets with the same kind of energy that our sisters and brothers in Miami had, but we need that energy. We need to harness it. We need to direct it into movements with slogans and concrete demands and a clear strategy for victory.
The second part of the question had to do with what appears to be a marriage between certain foreign policies of the United States and certain domestic policies. And I think the best example is the Cuban so-called refugees, which are now in Miami and Union City and many other regions here. How do you read that?
Of course, I don't think it was accidental that at the same time that there was this mass hysteria regarding Afghanistan that was orchestrated by the ideologues of the system in this country, there was also the focus on the so-called failure of the Cuban Revolution and the situation of the refugees. A very small percentage of the people of Cuba have come to this country. And I think that the response of the majority of the Cuban people indicated the strength of the Cuban Revolution. Unfortunately, some people are misled. They are captured by myths and illusions. Unfortunately, I'm sure there were those in Cuba who believe that milk and honey flow through the streets in the United States, who believe that all they had to do was to come that 90 miles and they would have a Cadillac and a huge mansion and so forth. Well, you see, that's the way the CIA works in this country. And I wouldn't doubt that there have been conscious efforts to woo the people of Cuba by telling them all you have to do is come to the United States and you will find the good life. People in Cuba are living better than they've ever lived before. And I've personally seen the changes. They have a medical system healthcare system that outstrips anything we have in this country, which they have created over a period of 2 decades. And we could go on talking about the housing that has been built, talking about the fact that people no longer have to cut their fingers off at the end of a cane cutting season just in order to be able to get a little insurance money to tide them through a few weeks or a few months. I would really advise anyone who wants to witness revolutionary enthusiasm to make a trip to Cuba. The people of Cuba, the revolution is stronger than ever before, and it is amazing that despite the efforts of the U.S. government here in the heartland of imperialism to smash that revolution ideologically, to smash it physically, the blockade, the presence of troops on Guantanamo Bay, etc., that the people of Cuba have indeed prevailed. And of course, we know that their ability to prevail has also been facilitated by the aid and assistance that's come from the socialist community of nations.
And you're tuned to WBAI in New York City, and we're talking with Angela Davis, who is the vice presidential candidate on the Communist Party ticket for Vice President of the United States of America. We shall return in a few minutes. Our telephone number is area code 212-279-3400, if you'll care to speak with Ms. Davis, 279-3400. We'll be back in about 2 minutes or so. And we're back live on WBAI. We're talking with Angela Davis, who is the vice presidential candidate on the Communist Party ticket for this upcoming November election. Hello, WBAI, you on the air? Please turn your radio down.
Down. I too respond to Ms. Davis, what she said earlier concerning black people being sophisticated in reference to the Palestinians.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, I feel that black people aren't as sophisticated as she and others make them out to be. I don't think black people have reached the point of sophistication where they make demands and ask for some type of qualification from those people who come to them and claim to be brothers in the struggle and ask them for their support. They ask black people for their support, and black people willingly give it, and when it's time to get support from those groups go on their merry way, and no support comes down the line. Black people have not learned to to make demands, to make these people give put strings on their support, whether it be financial, spiritual, moral, or whatever. And I don't see why we should support anybody, Palestinians or whoever, black or white, and anywhere else in the world, if we're not going to get something back in return. Nobody gives up anything for nothing. I don't think we should.
Well, Brother, we should be proud of the fact that as black people, throughout the history of our presence in this country, we have had a kind of instinctive ability to understand where injustice lies. And we have not been selfish. We have not been selfish. I think that is extremely important. That has been forged, I think, from our history as slaves, our struggles for liberation, and we've understood that wherever there is injustice, that is where our struggle should be. Certainly, you are right in talking about the need for mutual solidarity, but I wonder whether you've traveled at all in other countries and have seen the concern of people in the Middle East, for example, for the situation of black people in this country, the concern of people who live on the continent of Africa or even in Asia, in Latin America. Of course, there are Arabs who are opposed to the interests of black people. There are Arabs who are opposed to the interests of the masses of Arabs. There are black people in this country who objectively fight against black liberation. I think that we have to be very clear that it's not simply a question of color. It's a question of consciousness. It's a question of class. It's a question of in whose interest one struggles. Perhaps you'll have the opportunity to meet with some Arab sisters and brothers who have been conducting solidarity movements for black people in this country who fought, for example, in countries in the Middle East for the freedom of Reverend Ben Chavis. There's a lot of problems with what you say, and I really wish you would examine the situation a little more closely. You call the Soviet Union a colonial power, and
actually, you said the largest.
The largest, and I'm really quite sad that you fail to recognize the deeds of the country in which you live, the government of the country in which you live. The Soviet Union does not own one factory outside of its borders. When you talk, you have to be a little clear. When you talk about things like colonialism and imperialism, you have to understand that there is a world of difference between the Soviet Union giving assistance to a people attempting to struggle for their liberation, to a people attempting to build a new society, and the U.S. government attempting to support all of the counter-revolutionary forces that have emerged around the world. Unfortunately, it would take quite a long...
Convenient for you because the truth seems to frighten you, and it's unfortunate you become nothing more than a Stalinist parody of what you once were.
Well, I did not interrupt you when you were speaking. I wish you would give me the same courtesy. And as I said, I'm quite sad to listen to you because I think that you have been terribly misinformed, and you will not be in a position to make the kinds of contributions that will be necessary in order to further the revolutionary movement around the world. But thank you for calling.
Thank you for calling. And thank you for calling. You're on the air. Hello?
Yes.
It's you on the air.
Yes. First, let me express greetings to Sister Angela, and to say that as a high school teacher in New York, we've used her autobiography as a guide to people who've been involved in struggle. But Sister Angela is not just an individual, she's also a representative of the Communist Party USA. So the questions I had for her were a two-part question. First part of the question was, given the historical position politically of the Communist Party USA on the question of black people being a nation and having the right to self-determination in the Black Belt South, it seems that at present the CPUSA has changed that position and talk about the question of black people's struggle against racism. So I'd like to get clear from her, given the struggle in this country, given the significance of the Miami Rebellion, what is her position on the question of black people's struggle in the United States at this present time? Is her political position that black people have the right to self-determination up to and including succession? That's the first question. The second question had to do with the question of the position on peaceful transition, that it is a clear position of the CPUSA, and also I'd like to add of the Soviet Union, that it's possible to make the transformation from capitalism to socialism peacefully. I wonder if the sister could speak on whether this has ever taken place in the history of the world. Politically myself, I don't think it has, and I don't think it ever will. But if the sister has some concrete examples to show of where people have transformed to socialism peacefully, where that has happened, and what that would mean for people in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, to answer your first question, if you are really interested in the position of the Communist Party on the struggle for Afro-American liberation, we just published a document that came out of our last convention, which you can get at our bookstore. You pointed out that it was the position of the Communist Party that black people constituted a nation, which gave us the right to self-determination, including secession. That was the position of the Communist Party, and it reflected the objective situation of black people in the Black Belt in the South. Things have changed. Since that period, there have been tremendous migrations, as you no doubt know. Black people have become an integral part of the working class in this country, are central to the industrial working class in this country, of course. And so that in order to reflect the changing times, in order to reflect the situation of black people correctly and scientifically, the party's position on the struggle for black liberation has, of course, changed. Now, we speak both about the need to struggle against racism and about the struggle for Afro-American liberation. There is still a national dimension of black people's struggle for liberation. And if you want to examine that in closer detail, you can, as I said before, acquire the document that we recently prepared. The struggle against racism is a struggle that must be undertaken by all progressive people in this country, of all colors. It is an absolute responsibility of white workers in order to develop the kind of class consciousness and class unity that will be necessary in order to overturn the system of monopoly capitalism, to consistently fight racism. Now, your second question, you asked two, very deep and complex and interesting questions. The question of peaceful transition to socialism. Well, let me perhaps say from a personal perspective that I would like to see a peaceful transition to socialism. I've seen enough blood in my relatively brief lifetime, too much already. At the same time, I should point out that our party makes it very clear that we have every right to defend our gains. Whether or not there is an absolutely peaceful transition to socialism depends on the reaction of the ruling class. Our strategy is to develop a movement, to develop an anti-monopoly coalition, to develop the kind of movement in this country that by its very power and force cannot but be recognized and will indeed kick out the old two-party system, will indeed allow us to embark upon the path to socialism. If there are efforts to prevent us from doing that, we, of course, as the people of this country, have every right to defend ourselves, so that I would suggest that if we want to ensure a peaceful transition, that we'd better be about the business of preventing those who are in the ruling circles of this country from using the violence.
Thank you for calling. Hello, you on the air?
Hi. Debbie, can you turn the radio down? Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
I'd like to ask Andrew Davis a question that's perhaps more theoretical. What I don't understand is why, if there are certain countries in which certain socialist programs have been begun, is it that the American Communist Party has to declare some kind of allegiance with them, even although those countries' programs have not been sort of perfect Marxist program, nor exhibited all the best and most useful means of reaching proper kind of socialism?
Well, if I understood your question correctly, I would point out that to be a communist means to be involved in an international movement. The struggle of working people of the working class is a struggle that stretches all around the globe. Now, I think that when you talk about our party declaring its allegiance, you use terms that are designed to create a false impression of the unity and solidarity that does exist among people involved in the world communist movement. We, as the Communist Party of the United States of America, make our own decisions about the situation in this country. We are a democratic organization. We have conventions in which people are comrades from all over the country, elected by in the areas from which they come together, share their ideas, and we reach a collective decision. At the same time, of course, we support our comrades, our sisters and brothers in Cuba. We support the Soviet Union. We support the people who are attempting to build socialism in Vietnam. We support those who are attempting to build socialism in African countries. That's what international solidarity is all about. And I might add that the election campaign, which we are conducting at this moment, in New York specifically, we must collect some 40,000 signatures in order to get the Communist Party on the ballot, is a part of that broader struggle.
Okay, Angela, we have time for just one very short question and hopefully response. Hello, you're on the air. Hello?
Hello, I'd like to know where the Communist Party stands on the homosexual issue.
Well, that's a question, I think, that involves the democratic rights of people in this country. And we support the democratic rights of gay people in this country. That's a very clear position that we have.
Angela, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt the caller and you at the same time. We have just about 5 minutes remaining. In fact, less than 3-point-something minutes. In closing, could you tell us what is the status of the campaign? You mentioned the question of signatures. Could you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, I was noticing that time was running out, and I wanted to be able to say before the end of the program that we are appealing to people in New York to get involved in the effort to collect the 40,000 signatures that are necessary to put the Communist Party on the ballot. It's amazing how difficult it is for parties outside of the two-party system to get on the ballot. And we feel that people who are not necessarily members of the Communist Party should indeed become involved in this fight as an expression of their desire to see the growth of independent politics in this country, so that if people would like to get involved in the effort to collect signatures, they can get in touch with the Hall Davis campaign, and 1123 Broadway, and the room 201, and the telephone number 929-5944. That's 929-5944. Yeah.
929-5944. We are at the end. Thank you very much, Angela Davis, for being with us. Angela Davis is running as the vice presidential candidate on the Communist Party USA ticket. We urge you, if I might indulge, to support that ticket. Thank you very much for being with us.
And thank you for inviting us.